Hi, everybody. I hope you had a good week and enjoyed the beautiful weather this weekend. This week, you're going to be reading Chapter 4 from Bonnie Thurston's book. Before I talk about Chapter 4, I want to discuss the discussion question from this past week because I know it was really challenging for you. But I just want to kind of explain that a little bit further. So, you were reading about Paul's letters, which again were the first things written in the New Testament. And I asked you, to pick something that was descriptive and prescriptive and to try to say how the message would change. And the point I was trying to make is that today people will read the letters from St. Paul and they'll read things like the passage about women needing to wear a veil or women needing to be silent in church, and they'll take that literally. And so in some churches, this is the expectation that women are kind of subservient to men, and that we don't speak, that we don't have a role, that we wear veils. And I think when people translate it like that, they're looking at Paul's passages to be prescriptive, prescribing how things should be, when it's very likely that many of them were simply descriptive, describing how things were. And so it might be a good argument to use if you aren't satisfied with the way people are translating that. We can't know for sure how Paul intended it. And of course, as the book pointed out, Paul is a thinker in process. He is someone who is kind of evolving as he goes. We also, like I said last week, don't know what's going on in the background for the people involved. He's writing specific letters to a specific audience to address some sort of concerns, and we don't always know what those concerns are. And so I think you all made great attempts at answering those questions. I do know it was sort of challenging, but I really did like reading what you wrote, and I like the effort that you put into it, so thank you for doing that. I think this week will be much easier. This week you're reading a chapter about Mark's Gospel and John's Gospel. There's a later chapter about Luke's Gospel, but there aren't any chapters about Matthew's Gospel. So I want to talk about Matthew's Gospel just for a moment. And before I do that, the first one that you'll read about this week is Mark's Gospel. We think this Gospel was written first, between 60 and 70 AD. I kind of would argue more for a later one, like 68 to 70 AD. Matthew and Luke wrote around the same time as each other. And Luke focuses much more on women and sort of the lowly people, the lower class people, where Matthew's focus is much more on important men and the higher class people. And it's because of that that Matthew's gospel is really not discussed at all in this book. It's kind of unfortunate because I think Matthew's gospel helps us understand Jesus as more of the teacher and highlights a lot of the important teachings of Jesus and several parables that are unique to Matthew. But in the end, when this book is about women, it makes sense that it's not the one that's discussed. And it's interesting, this chapter talks about Mark and John because Mark, as I said, was written first, but John was written last. And so Mark's is kind of a rudimentary gospel. It's very action-packed. It's the shortest of the gospels. Whereas John is much more theological and very poetic, but it's a whole different theology by that time. And so you kind of get both ends of the spectrum with these two gospels. And it will highlight for you in the chapter different stories about some of these women, the women that are highlighted in Mark, the ones that are unique in John. And as I've been saying all along, if you don't know these stories, look them up in the Bible. Also read the stories in the Bible. Next week you have a quiz again. And then, as I said in an email, the paper is not actually due till October 8th. And the following week after that will be your midterm. When you do the midterm, you'll answer 40 questions and you'll have an hour and a half. If you do have any questions this week, please let me know. And I, again, am really enjoying reading your discussion posts. I know some of this is somewhat challenging, and that's the idea. I want to challenge you, but at the same time, I understand that much of it is new to you, so I'm, not taking off as much for what I would consider accuracy, or if I agree, or if theologians agree, because I want you to try to make an educated guess about this based on what you've read. Anyway, have a great week. I'll talk to you next week.